In this lesson, we're going to continue working with the layered Photoshop file we imported during the last lesson and change its layers into a 3D scene. If you didn't do the last lesson before coming here, go back to that one and import this Photoshop file so you'll be ready to work along with this lesson. For this particular task, what I want to take advantage of are these individual axis layers. And I'd like to manipulate those layers into a 3D scene. I mentioned in an earlier lesson that action is the only area of smoke where we can do 3D animation. The tools we have for doing that include views that allow us to see where we're moving things in 3D space. When I'm working on moving objects in 3D space, it's helpful to see different views of those objects as I work. I'm going to keep my schematic on the left so I can get access to the controls that I need for each layer. And I'm going to click on this right viewport and look at what some of our options are. When I'm working on a scene in action, one of the things I want to be sure of is that I know where I'm looking in the scene. I'm going to check my zoom on this second viewport. I'm going to zoom out a bit to get a wider view. And one of the things I want to point out is that in this view, you can actually see what the view is of the frame of the scene. And you'll notice that this is a very high resolution Photoshop file that actually fits outside of that view. So it is good to understand what your view will actually be when this is exported. My default view here is default camera. You'll notice in my schematic I have a camera, and we will actually take a look at moving that camera in the scene to create motion in this scene. But it's good to understand where the framing of that camera is. For the moment, I'm going to change the view back to fit, and that fits me to the view of the camera. Now, when I'm working on manipulating layers in 3D space, the view I find the most helpful for that is what's called top view. I'm going to change my view in this right viewport, and what I'm looking for are these action 3D views. You can look at 3D scenes from the front, from the side, and from the top. And we also have the option here to switch to our default camera view, which is the same as our action output view. And we also have an option called perspective that lets you move from different angles of the scene. I'm going to go to this top view. And what I get from the top view, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. From the top view, what I'm seeing here is the width of the camera frame. And you'll notice I have this green angle here. This green angle is actually the lens of the camera. So here's my camera, and here is the viewing angle of my camera. We're going to actually move that around in a bit. And then you see all these items here. These are actually all of the axis controls for the individual Photoshop layers. In order to create depth in this scene, I'm going to set these individual layers we have for the background, the clouds, and the town layers at different points in Z depth so that it looks like there is space in the scene. To control any individual layer, double-click its axis node. I'm going to double-click the axis node for the background, and you'll notice that that highlights the axis control here. If I'm looking at a top view and my camera is here from the front, this arrow pointing toward the front is the Z axis control. I can grab that arrow and I'm going to drag that background layer back in space. And you'll notice over here, it shows that I've set this back in space on the Z axis. You want to be careful when you've set something back in Z space. It will make it look like it's gotten smaller. So I'm going to go back to my default camera view and make sure my background is still wide enough to fit the camera view. It looks like it is. But if you ever move something back in space and it becomes not large enough and you'd like to keep the depth, you can always then scale that layer up. I can make sure that background is filling my camera view. I'm going to go back to my top view. And again, you can also get used to these keyboard shortcuts. F4 takes me to results, and Shift 4 takes me to top. So I'm often switching back and forth between those. I might do Shift 4 to go to my top, and then F4 to go back to the default camera view, and go back and forth between those as I manipulate them. So take just a moment, use these individual axis controls to move the layers in space. And again, we're just trying to create some depth in the scene. So you don't need to put them in any particular places. You can put them anywhere you want. I also have these two smoke layers. These, maybe instead of moving in space, maybe I'll move them side to side, or I'll put one further back so I have smoke in different layers. And then again, I'll hit F4 to come back to my front view. Now what I've done is created a little bit more of a sense of depth already. I'm going to switch this back to fitting the view. You can already see there's a little bit of sense of depth to this already. Let's add just a little bit of animation to make that point, and then this is the sort of thing you could come back and really spend a lot of time with. The first thing I'm going to animate are those smoke layers. I'm going to make them move across the screen so that you can see from beginning to end of the scene that they are moving. The easiest way to animate for something simple like that is to turn on auto key. So I'm going to turn on auto key. Here at the first frame of my scene, for each of those smoke layers, I'm going to set a beginning position in X. So there's one of my smoke layers. I can see it moving there to the left of the scene. And there's my other smoke layer. If I double click its axis layer, I'm going to find where there's my other smoke layer further back there behind some other buildings. Because I had auto key turned on when I made those two changes, I did drop a keyframe here at the first keyframe. I'm going to move the playhead to the last frame of the scene, and I'm going to take the smoke layer that's to the left, and I'm going to move it to the right of the scene. And I'm going to take the smoke layer that's to the right and move it to the left of the scene. And again, because I had auto key turned on, that created a keyframe underneath here. And let me just point out something, because we've had auto key turned on, I have created animation. You'll notice if I move the playhead, I can now see those layers moving back and forth because they are moving from the first position that I keyframed to the last position I keyframed. You'll also notice in the controls down here, if my playhead is on a position where I've made a keyframe, those values that are animated will be underlined in yellow. If I move the playhead away from that keyframe, I will still be able to tell which values are animated because they'll be underlined in blue. That just means, yes, this value is animated. I'm not currently sitting on a keyframe. And so now as I play that scene, those smoke layers move through the scene. I'm already creating some kinds of interesting animation and movement in the scene. Let's add one final element. Let's talk about this default camera. I'm going to come back to my top view. Again, Shift 4. And I'm going to zoom out a bit. I'm going to leave auto key turned on, and I'm going to put my playhead on the first frame. And again, you can see those layers moving back and forth. You can create animation by moving the camera that's looking at the scene. You'll notice that one of the objects I can get control of is this default camera, and there's several ways to do that. One is, in my schematic, I can double click that camera to get access to it, and that gives me access to those controls. Or I can also simply move the camera here in the scene. And this is one of those things you want to be careful of. I don't want to ever move the camera far enough out that it gets outside of that range of the scene. I would now see empty scene over here. But what I'm going to do is create some animation of moving through those layers so you can see the depth. So here I've already moved the camera at this starting playhead position, so I've created keyframes already. And I'm going to move the playhead to the end of the scene and push the camera forward. And that will create another keyframe. Let's go back to our default camera view and look what happens as I move through the scene. Now I'm zooming in, the smoke is moving, I'm starting to see the depth in those layers as my camera gets closer, and some layers are closer to me than others. And that is a very simple 3D scene with camera movement using a layered Photoshop file. You can obviously do a lot more with this, but this gives you an idea of some things to play with.